Luke chapter 15, verse 11 through 24. Now here's reading of God's word. And he said, there was a man who had 2 sons. And the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me my share of property that is coming to me. And he divided his property between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had and took a journey into a far country. And there he squandered his property in reckless living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into the fields to feed pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. And he arose and came to his father. But while he was still a long ways off, his father saw him and felt compassion, ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, bring quickly the best robe, put it on him. Put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet. And bring the fattened calf and kill it. And let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to celebrate. Today's story is the last of a series of parables that Jesus shares in Luke 15. Today, the parable of the lost sheep, coin were the 2 parables that he shares in the earlier section of this chapter. And then followed by the parable of the lost son, or the prodigal son, which is probably what is more widely recognized or known as. But the main idea of the 3 parables is this: that something is lost, it is found, and there is a celebration. Have you ever lost something and found it? Most of us probably have a lost and found story. We definitely have a lost story. We lost something. Sometimes we find it, sometimes we don't. But we all have a story where we can relate to, I think, this idea of the series of parables. Something is lost. And if you ever lost something, especially something of value, it doesn't have to be monetary value, but maybe it has a personal significance. There's no value to it because it's so precious. Maybe something that reminds you. Someone I know, their car was robbed, broken into. They took a whole bunch of things. And one of the items that was lost was grandfather's old pocket watch. Has some value to it, but it's the feeling of losing that. Or I know some people who have lost like knives. There are some people who are into knives, and knives that have certain kind of a memory of a person, a father or grandfather. If you've ever lost something, especially something of value, then you know the feeling of desperation as you frantically begin to search. You look for it and you're like, where did it go? And immediately you pause everything. You start retracing your steps. When did I see it last? When's the last time I used it? Where could it be? And you begin to process and retrace all of these things. You leave no stone unturned. But what is the feeling when you actually find it? Isn't it relief followed by joy? That's the story here of the parables. Lost sheep, lost coin, lost son. But the context of these parables is a result of an accusation that is made by the religious leaders towards Jesus. We're going to look at chapter 15, verse 2. It says this: and the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled, saying, this man receives sinners and eats with them. We're into the 15th chapter of Luke. Listen to what the Pharisees are grumbling about. This Jesus, this guy hangs out with sinners. He eats with tax collectors. That is their central issue. the religious leaders, you see, they had divided people into two groups. In terms of all humanity, okay, at that time, religious leaders divided people into two groups. Unclean, which would be what they would call sinners. But notice, oftentimes, a specific job is also attached to that group: tax collectors. Tax collectors and sinners, that's always the reference that we see. So they divided them into the unclean, and then the other group is what? The righteous. Guess where they saw themselves? Which group do the religious leaders see themselves? Unclean or the righteous? Of course, it was the righteous. And it was from that position they always judged those on the other side. And when they look at Jesus, they're like, what is wrong with this guy? He eats with sinners. He eats with tax collectors. The sinners and tax collectors are the group of people that Jesus frequently hung out with. The story of Zacchaeus is a famous one. He was a tax collector. Jesus says, hey, I'm going to come to your house tonight. And Zacchaeus is like, awesome. He comes and the religious leaders are just appalled. How can he go into the home of this tax collector, of this sinner? So the Pharisees had an issue. They had a problem with Jesus, not just hanging out with them, but eating with them. They couldn't believe that Jesus would enter the home of sinners. They couldn't believe that Jesus would associate with such people. This is something that they would never dare do themselves. Why? Because they are the righteous. Never would they associate with the unclean. So Jesus tells these three parables as a response to their accusations. The prodigal son, or the lost son, the parable, is probably one of the most well-known. Along with the Good Samaritan, it's probably one of the most well-known stories of the Bible. This past week, Abby, we were watching the news. I don't know if it was this week or it was the end of last week. But you know the snowstorm that we got hit with. And so I think it was a story either over the last weekend or earlier last week. I happened to turn the TV on. And the heading of the video clip of the story was, Good Samaritan saves the day. And so the news story talked about this guy who lives near a East 205 somewhere. He lives near an off-ramp on the highway. He's lived in that area a long time because he knows when it snows, people have a really hard time coming up that off-ramp and onto the streets. So what he decided to do is to help. But he initially went to help his friend who called him and said, hey, I'm stuck. I can't get going. And a bunch of cars are stuck here. So he loaded up his car. He had a little tow strap. And he went and he pulled his friend out, towed him up to a safe distance. But then he could not ignore all the people that were stuck on that off-ramp. So he began to pull one by one each car. Some 20 or 30 cars he helped that day. He was a little ambitious. There was an 18-wheeler. He tried to pull that. He said, I gave it my best shot, but I couldn't get that thing to move. It's an incredible story. And Abby asked me, Good Samaritan, isn't that in the Bible? And then she asked me, who are the Samaritans? Because she's thinking, wait a minute, in the Bible there's a story of Good Samaritan, and here's a Good Samaritan today. This guy must be a Samaritan. I said, no, he's American probably. And I had to explain to her, even the story in the Bible talks, we know that story, but when we say a Good Samaritan, it's always a reference to that story in the Bible because it's so widely known. Somebody who you don't expect to helping. So we have Bible stories that are very common to people. It's a very knowledgeable story, and this is one of the stories. I think we're all very familiar with the story. But one of the things I discover about this story is that there's a certain richness to the story. There's so many different angles. And today we really just stop at the interaction of the father and the younger son. There's a part of the older son in the rest of this verses up to verse 34, I believe, when the older son kind of enters the picture. You could probably do an incredible series of just either the Bible study or sermon series looking at the dynamics of the story. It's that deep. And each time I read it, I reflect upon it, and there's something new that comes up, something that I haven't really reflected on or have really seen in the past. This morning, I would like for us to see the beauty in the Father's forgiveness. Beauty in the Father's forgiveness. And in order for us to see the beauty in the forgiveness, there has to be an act that requires forgiving. That's where the younger son comes in. Two big points this morning is we're going to look at the two characters. It's the dishonorable son we look at first. Look at verses 11 through 13. And he said, there was a man who had two sons. And the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me. He divided his property between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had and took a journey into a far country. And there he squandered his property in reckless living. We look at the actions of the younger son. As we read the story, and if we can picture ourselves hearing the story for the first time from the mouth of Jesus, okay, you're in the audience. As Jesus tells this story, there will be one shocking moment after another. It's there throughout the story. The first shocking statement or element of the story is the great dishonor of the younger son. Why? Because he asked for his inheritance. He asked for his inheritance while his father is still alive. What he was effectively saying with this request is, Father, I wish you were dead. Why? Because inheritance is something that is generally given after the death of a parent. He's saying, you know what? I want my share now. Give it to me now. That's kind of the demand. We see his selfishness, right? Technically, the father could divide his inheritance while he was alive, but traditionally, it was more customary for the children to receive it after the death of their father. This was an unusual request, and it shows, I think, his disrespect for his father. The younger son requests implied great dishonor to his dad. It reveals his rebellious attitude, not just towards his father, but to his family. And the law of Moses prescribes consequences or treatment for a son who displays stubbornness and rebellion towards the family. Deuteronomy 21, verses 18 through 21, it says this: If a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey the voice of the father or the voice of his mother, and though they discipline him, will not listen to them, then his father and his mother shall take hold of him and bring him out to the elders of his city at the gate of the place where he lives. And they shall say to the elders of his city, This our son is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of the city shall stone him to death with stones. So you shall purge the evil from your midst, and all Israel shall hear and fear. Wow. Punishment for rebellious attitude. You could take him. Take that rebellious son. You could stone him. This was the letter of the law. How often did it occur? I'm not sure. But there was solution to. There was a way that is biblically prescribed of dealing with rebellious children. But the father does not follow the letter of the law. Okay, remember the shocking request. Each element of the story, various elements of the story, various points, there is a shock moment. Here's another one. The disrespectful request by this younger son is honored. To the shock of the audience, Jesus says that the father divided his property for his two sons. He didn't rebuke his son. He honored his request. Many in the audience would have shaken their heads in disbelief at the respect of the younger son. They would have been surprised to hear that the father gives the younger son his share of the inheritance, even after the disrespect, the dishonor. The shock continues as we read the story. The younger son moves out. Soon after he got his inheritance, he gathered all of his belongings. He leaves home for a faraway country. This is like pouring salt into the wound. You've already brought shame to the father. You've already said, you know what, I wish you were dead. Packs up and he leaves. It's like pouring salt to the wound. I never really understood that my parents saw my desire to move out of the house when I was living here, when I was single. The desire to move out of the house in this kind of same way. Me and my friends decided, you know what? It's time for us to move out. Let's live together. So we found an apartment. We got the application. We had it all filled out. We're like, whoa, shouldn't we notify our parents that we plan to move out? I said, okay. So we all said, all right, we'll go home, tell our parents, and then we'll get back together. We'll turn in the application tomorrow, and we'll move in. Like 2 hours later, I get a phone call from the first guy. Hey, my dad is going crazy. I was like, funny thing is, my dad's going crazy too. At that time, the other friend calls, he goes, dude, my father is freaking out. So we got together and we started talking about it. And then I'm trying to understand from my parents' perspective, right? I couldn't. None of us could. But there was one common theme among all three sets of parents is, you can't move out. People assume we have family issues. And if you move out, it'll look bad on us. I'm like, that's your reason? I mean, that was big for them, I guess. Moving out in this time, you don't leave your family behind. Your family is very critical. You need that support. You need that network. For him to abandon his family, his father, move out, it was like pouring salt into the wound. This also implies that he had no intention of coming back. He packed up everything he had, and he took off. He travels to a distant country. He's ready for a new life, ready for new adventures. He's armed with newfound wealth. We're not told, but this family has some money. His inheritance share as a younger son would have been about 1/3 of his father's estate. He goes, he takes it. How do you think he spent his inheritance? Well, not very wisely. Here's another shocking moment in the story. In the foreign land, he squandered all his money in reckless living. He spent everything he had. He didn't invest it. He didn't try to increase his money. He foolishly spent everything. He found himself without money and in need. And just then, the entire land is struck by famine. Look at verse 14. When he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country. He began to be in need. You know, at this point, what the audience is saying? Serves him right. He began to be in need. He had no family network to rely on in the time of need. Why? Because he left them. He had abandoned them. He was in a foreign land. But we know in the others gospels other gospels who also tell this story that he had made friends in this country. But you know, one of the things is that the friends were only there as long as the money was there. As soon as the money ran out, the friends abandoned him. He was alone. He had no network. In a time of need, there was no one that would help him. He was in crisis. Another shocking moment we see where he hits, this is absolute rock bottom. We're not told how old he was. So it's not possible. We're not sure what kind of skills this guy had. He was a younger child. How old was he? I don't know. Teens, late teens, early 20s? No idea. We don't know what kind of skills he possessed, but it seems like he didn't really have much skill because of the job that he ends up taking. So he becomes in need. Verse 15, so he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country who sent him into his fields to feed pigs. The only job he qualified for, only job maybe he could find, was feeding pigs. This is rock bottom. He was at the mountaintop not too long ago, had his money, living out his dreams without a care in the world. Now he's working, feeding pigs. He was a Jew. Pigs were considered unclean animals. This job would have been humiliating for a Jew. Once again, the audience is like, how could he take such a job? Another shocking moment. His son became a servant in a foreign land. At this point, you begin to feel for him, right? Poor guy. And there's a part of us that says, serves you right? But he has hit rock bottom. He's humiliated. He's hungry. He wasted everything that he had. Then his mind flashed to his father's house. Look at verse 17. When he came to himself, or when he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? In that moment, when he has hit rock bottom, he reflects upon the family, the father that he has left behind. He reflects back and realizes, you know what? The higher servants in my father's household have more than enough food. They are never hungry. Here I am suffering and hunger. He is determined to return to his father's house and ask to be hired as a servant. He knows that he has burned the bridge. He has forfeited his position as a son. So he returns to his father's house seeking a job. This is the dishonorable son. This is his story. We transition now then to the compassionate father. This honorable younger son has decided to head back home. He doesn't know what kind of reception is awaiting him. He expects the worst, and naturally or maybe rightfully so, right? If you follow the story along, once again, the audience is like, oh, this is going to be good. He's going to go back home. So they're already thinking in a response or consequence or a series of events that is awaiting him when he returns home. So the audience is already now thinking, okay, this is where we will see justice for this dishonorable son. But the response he gets is very different than probably what the audience anticipates. There is a shock factor here, but it's not in a negative way, but in a positive way. And through it, we see the compassionate father. Verse 20 first. And he arose and came to his father. Okay, now we see he is determined, and now in verse 20, he takes action. He rises, and he heads home. But while he was still a long ways off, his father saw him and felt compassion. I always love this detail. While he was a long way off, his father saw him, which means that the father was looking for him. From the day his younger son packed up and left the house, the father looked out into the horizon, hoping that his son would return. It shows his compassion and his love. His son disrespected him, he dishonored him, but he never stopped loving him. Each and every day, he looked out and wondered, is this the day my son returns? While he was still a long ways off, his father saw him. His father recognized him. And he continues. He ran, embraced him, and kissed him. It's been noted that this affection is uncommon for Jewish males. especially in public. Running, it doesn't happen. Shocking element of the story, once again, is to the audience, what? Maybe they hear, and he saw him and he ran to him, and they're like, he's probably gonna run and just tackle him and punch him or something, hit him, slap him up silly. But when they hear that he embraced him and kissed him, audience, once again, in their anticipation, what they expected, this was the complete opposite. His response of running, embracing, and kissing him reveals his heart of grace, mercy, forgiveness. He doesn't need to say anything to his son. His actions show clearly that he has forgiven him. He's simply happy for his son to be home. What the father does next continues on the element of shock. The father restores his lost son to sonship. You see, the son had rehearsed the line many times on the way home. Okay, when I see my dad, this was it, Father, I have sinned. I'm no longer worthy to be your son. Hire me, please hire me as your servant. Oh, no, how should I say this? Dad, no, Father, sir. He's rehearsing this line all the way home. Because he's ready. When he sees his father, he's ready to throw out the request. Because he's going back to looking for a job. He needs his father to hire him as one of the servants. He's hungry. He's in need. He's hopeless. There is no other choice. He did not know whether or not his father would offer him the job. He begins to speak, but the father interrupts in verse 22. But the father said to his servants, "Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet." In place of the old raggedy clothes that he was most likely wearing, the father gives him the finest robe to put on. The ring for his hand signified authority. Servants in the father's household do not have rings. He was given shoes to wear. The father, you see, had no intention of hiring him as one of his servants. If he did, then he would not have given him these things. The robe, the ring, the shoes, these items signified that he was restored to the family, that he was restored as a family member. The son has been completely forgiven and reconciled to his father. Let me invite the worship team up. You see, the audience probably anticipated, we know what the story is going to be. We know what the next part of the story is going to be. They have great anticipation. Some of us, we know, we watch things, we watch dramas, or we watch things, and we know, we can anticipate how the plot will go. But once in a while, there's a story, right, that completely flips the script. We're taken by surprise. I don't watch it often, but several of the Korean dramas, there was a time when one of the bad characters was finally revealed, and I was like, what? Right? It's totally unexpected. This is just like that. There are things that the audience is anticipating, certain outcomes, and it completely flips the script. When the younger son returned, they probably expected to hear that the son received his due punishment, consequences from his father, just as the laws prescribed, and surely as he deserved. But it didn't go as anticipated. Jesus tells them that the father did not dole out justice or lecture him. He welcomed him with open arms. He completely forgave his son. He restored his son to a position of honor. The father didn't have to. He had every right to hire him as a servant if he wanted, but we see the compassion of the father. God the Father is compassionate. He welcomes all people to become his beloved children. It doesn't matter what you have done. No sin is too great to be forgiven. All you have to do is return to the Father. as we respond in song this morning, may we search our hearts. And I want us to reflect upon this question. Is there something keeping you from coming back to the Father? Think about that, reflect upon that. But more than anything, reflect upon the compassion of the Father. He restored the Son to a position of honor. The Son has dishonored his Father. He has abandoned his Father. He has forfeited his position as a son. But when he returns home, the compassionate Father does what? Restores him to the place of honor. Restores the Son to sonship.